Welcome back, John. I think it's fair to say you're a cult figure.
In at least one sense of the word, yes. Thank you very much for having me on again. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah, it's great. No, I've got a funny little to riff to start this off. So, around these parts, there's a famous philosopher, Nick Land, who's kind of known as the dark sorcerer of the internet, you could say.
Hmm.
He was recently on a podcast called Theory Underground, and they're kind of like internet left-wing guys, and they've been trying
Hmm.
to set up this big debate, Nick Land versus Slavoj Žižek, the famous Slovenian communist, and that's kind
Hmm.
of the big boxing match of the century of internet philosophy. And they're going on it, and you heard Nick groan and go, "Oh, to be honest, I'd much rather talk to that weird druid guy."
Good heavens, he said that?
He said that.
He said that. Well, anytime you want to have Nick and I on the show, I'd be happy to. I'm somewhat familiar with his writing, although I won't claim to always be able to follow it. I'm sure he finds my stuff just as baffling, but that would be entertaining.
I think it would be great. Now, here's the thing. Nick Land is famously hard to reach. People get hold of him, but we've tried several times and haven't. So if anybody
Hmm.
is listening to this who does have a line to him and would like to
Yeah,
do
well, let him know that the weird druid guy is in case that's any incentive.
exactly, we've got the weird druid guy on the other line and we're ready to go. We haven't got the communist, we've got the weird druid, which I think is much more aligned with where we're at.
That's pretty good. The weird druid. I like that. I and a group of friends were in Glastonbury earlier this month. There were several reasons for that, including my birthday. But in Glastonbury, which of course is famous for its strangeness, and several of my readers were told there that they were weird for Glastonbury.
Oh, wow.
Oh, we all said woohoo!
That's an achievement.
I think it is. I think it is. Well, I have the best, although also the strangest commentary on the internet. So I think this is definitely a feather in their cap, or a bit of pterodactyl wing, or something like that.
What's your take on Glastonbury? Because I mean, its own mythology, right? Is that
Oh yeah.
it's an ancient sacred site of the British Isles.
Hmm.
Then it's also Avalon. It's supposedly where the Grail myth is all set. Supposedly,
Hmm.
was it Joseph of Arimathea? Someone from the Bible
Oh
supposedly
yeah.
wound up
Yeah,
there.
yeah. Joseph of Arimathea supposedly came there with a pair of cruets containing the blood and sweat of Jesus on the cross, and there's this amazing body of legend around. Whatever it might have been in the past, of course, it was a big deal in medieval times. One of the biggest pilgrimage sites in Britain was at Glastonbury for many years. It is certainly a mythic location now. Um, it also has some really good occult bookstores, which is also of interest to me. But it's important not to confuse myth and history,
Mhm.
and to some extent that could be a real disadvantage to people who try to confuse them. But if you're comfortable with the gap between them, with the distinction between them, it's possible just to go to Glastonbury and accept the myth in its present form and experience it as this rolling phenomenon with druids and knights and the Grail and ghostly monks and all kinds of marvelous things like that. It's a lot of fun. It is really one of my favorite places in the world.
Oh, me too. I love going there. Whenever I go there, I try
Mm-hmm.
to go once a year just to recharge the battery,
Mm-hmm.
to be honest.
Yeah, it has been 11 years since I'd last been there, and that was too long. But had a grand time, and we had that additional delight of finding out that my readers are actually strange by Glastonbury standards. So yeah.
So let's
Maybe we can get. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
no, you go, you go. I was going to change the
No,
topic.
maybe we could have Nick Land come meet us in Glastonbury. We'll sit there,
We can.
tossing back beers in the Georgian Pilgrims and having a probably the strangest conversation that has ever taken place in that town, which I know is saying something.
Well, that
Um,
would be something. That would put the Glastonbury Festival to shame.
I think honestly, if that were to happen, we might accidentally nudge the entire planet into an alternate timeline or something like that. But we'll see.
Well, I think so. That's the thing. Nick Land right now seems to be based in, is it Shanghai or Shenzhen or something like
I
that?
think it was Shanghai. I think it was Shanghai last I was keeping up with his work. But yeah.
Yeah, the city that's going to become a corporate artificial intelligence first.
Maybe it already is.
There we go. There we go. What I was going to say, I was going to move us on to the conversation around. You wrote a book several
Mm-hmm.
years ago now called The King in Orange, which
Mm-hmm.
was an attempt to read essentially the rise and the breakthrough of Donald Trump and the populist movement
Mm-hmm.
around him. Both, I think, looking
Mm-hmm.
at social and political forces, but also at the occult forces around it as well, strange
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
number codes and all of that stuff, Keck frogs and blah 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 blah.
Yes.
We're about 9 years on from that, and we've got Trump 2.0, and it's
Mm-hmm.
as batshit as the first ride. What's your, if you were going to do an update to the King in Orange, where would you start it?
The first thing I point out is that um, I was correct in noting that you can't just get rid of an archetype. Um, the 2020 election, whatever the circumstances, turned out to be nothing more than a temporary road bump in the process by which the King in Orange, as I've called him, is unfolding his alternate reality. The issue that I think is crucial here is that what in the book I call the salary class, which has been the dominant class in the Western world since the Great Depression. The salary class policies, the policies that it has pursued, that aggrandized itself and benefited its members at the expense of everyone else, made someone like Donald Trump inevitable. And the more frantically they push back, the more loudly they insist that all is for the best and the best of all possible worlds. If only we can get rid of that horrible orange monster. After a defeat and a respite, the orange shadow takes shape and rises again, and it will keep on happening. If until the necessary changes take place, until we see an end to the policies that drive the rise of populism, you could just see one after another, after another, after another. I commented in a blog post some years ago. It's really fascinating. You have all this imagery of the shadow, and it's Tolkien. The quote that I made was a parody of something from the Fellowship of the Ring, and it's precisely the shadow that we're dealing with here in a Jungian sense. What's rising up now to confront the salary class, to confront the self-proclaimed good people, is their own shadow, the reflection of their own abusive behavior toward everybody else, and especially toward the working classes, the wage classes, I called it in the book. Until that changes, and they've shown no signs of being willing to change it, the shadow will take shape and rise again. So on the one hand, one of the things that I pointed out is no, 2020 didn't settle anything. It doesn't matter how frantically the salary class tries to drag things back to a kind of ancien regime state. That's changed. And now that Trump is back in office, now that we're seeing the permanent bureaucracy being pruned with a meat axe, now that we're seeing cuts to the whole system of financial diversion, which causes billions of dollars every year to be poured into various off-book NGOs and other establishments of the permanent bureaucracy. Those changes are not going to. They may be reversed temporarily. They may be reversed but that's the whole system that made that possible is breaking down. The U.S. is no longer able to borrow limitless amounts of money as the dollar's control, or the dollar's place as the universal global reserve currency, as that breaks down. So we have to embrace these changes. We have to let go of the infinite proliferation of bureaucracy, the infinite proliferation of cubicle warriors. Here's the problem. Let's solve it by hiring bureaucrats and commissioning studies. That's over. We actually have to deal with our problems now. And we're going to be dealing with it, especially in the United States, in a condition of much less money, much fewer resources, and generally a rougher time for all. And so I quite understand most people don't want to deal with that.
Mm. So is there a thread or a story or a pattern forming from these cracks in the dying regime? Or Let's put it this
Hmm.
way. If we take these cracks
Okay.
as a whole, what is that hole?
The well, I think to some extent the story is the emperor's new clothes, because here is our emperor parading about in a garment of competence and efficiency, and we can fix the world, and those clothes never existed. And quite a number of children are saying, "You realize you're stark naked, don't you?" And of course, that's the problem, because the whole excuse for the salary class, for the permanent bureaucracy, for what I've elsewhere called the laptop class, is that they're the competent ones, they're the smart ones, they're the ones who can make the world work, and they can't, and they aren't. And so the cracks that are opening up are simply, well, Arnold Toynbee, in a study of history, in his vast 12-volume survey of the decline and fall of empires, points out that basically the driving force behind the collapse of societies is that elite classes stop solving problems. As long as an elite class can keep on solving the problems, the people of the society will more or less tolerate them. But if they stop solving the problems and instead just go, oh well, that's not important. We're going to spend all of our time concerning ourselves with these other issues over here, which we prefer to talk about, then down they go. And either the society replaces them, or the society itself goes down if they wedge themselves too tightly into place. And so that's kind of a more extensive and more spectacular version of the emperor's new clothes. The emperor puts on his non-existent clothes and walks out into an Arctic winter, and that's the end of him. But it amounts to the same thing. Those who we tasked with managing society and solving its problems have not done so. And so we're going through a standard elite replacement cycle where they're being shoved aside and replaced by a new rising elite of entrepreneurs.
What do you make of the new entrepreneurial class then? Because this is maybe to join up with our interests in religion and spirituality and the occult as well.
Mm-hmm.
The managerial class had their faith, the very sort of late civilizational rationalist faith in their
Mm-hmm.
abstract codes of justice and, like you said, their committee,
Mm-hmm.
their studies and
Mm-hmm.
the tech class, certainly what you see of them on X, it seems to be this sort of wing of the Western Faustian spirit that's got this romantic, like we're just going to fly to, I mean, literally Elon Musk, we're just going to fly into space. Ever, let us go.
Yeah. Well, this is very standard. This is very standard. We are at the end of the Western world's age of reason, and every civilization has one. Every civilization assumes that its age of reason is the one that matters, the one that will finally cast aside superstition and ignorance for all, and, forever. And then, of course, they find out the hard way that the human mind is not that smart. And all of these rationalists, these rational plans and these grand, projects land with a flop, if not a splat. And then the age of reason winds to an end, and we have the same thing we're starting to see now, the flight back to traditional religion, what Oswald Spengler called the second religiosity. So the tech bros are a transitional class. They are sort of caught in between these two phases. You can see this. Musk is a great example of the sort of late rationalist. Well, of course we can fly to Mars because we are tech, we are infinite, we are man, conqueror of nature, and all that drivel. It would be, I think, helpful, although it would be rather cruel, for Trump to actually, or Trump, what I was saying, for Musk to actually go to Mars, and then have to report back slowly as he dies of cancer because, or radiation poisoning, because outside of Earth's magnetosphere, space is full of hard radiation, and Mars has no magnetosphere of its own. So there he is, basking in gamma rays. Watching a temporary colony stuck on Mars as its members die horribly would be, I think, a useful, just a horrible thing to say, but it might be useful as a way to bring people to an awareness of the distance between those outworn, shop-worn 1920s fantasies of space travel that so many people are still stuck in, and the reality of a solar system that contains one planet where human beings can actually live. One way or another, whether it involves tech bros, slowly frying in gamma rays on Mars, or some slightly less dramatic denouement, I think it's very likely we're going to see that transition take place, not immediately, but within the decades to come. We're going to see the tech bros start following the flow into that second religiosity. We're going to see them start taking up some more traditional religion, not because they have any particular draw towards spiritual experience, but because that the same reason that the second religiosity happens at all. It's a flight from chaos. It's an attempt to get out of the confusion and despair of the collapse of the Age of Reason by going back to something that more or less provides a meaningful framework for social life. And I think probably as they become the new elite class, the tech bros, the entrepreneurial class, is going to be sucked into that, is going to be drawn into that role. And so, if not Musk, then some Muskian successor, will be publicly converting to some respectable form of Christianity and funding some spectacular church. Imagine imagine $10 billion put into building a church sometime. Comparable to what, for example, the Russians did with their Cathedral of the Armed Forces not that long ago. But in the meantime, we've got that sort of intermediate stage. We've got where the last crazed fantasies of the Age of Reason, these dreams borrowed from 1920s pulp science fiction, still clinging to life because they are the substitutes for religion. They are the visions of going to heaven with the serial numbers filed off.
I will say one thing. It would be fantastic to see Elon going to Mars and tweeting about it. That was not predicted in any of the science fiction books.
In fact, one of the embarrassing things about science fiction is that so many of the writers of the 1950s and 60s in science fiction were so sure that they were mapping out the human future, and they were generally dead wrong. Almost every significant fact whizzed right on past them, while the things they predicted, we were supposed to be sending ships to the stars by now. Guess what?
Nope.
Not going to happen in our time, not going to happen in the lifetime of our species. There are very straightforward reasons for that. And the sooner we stop pretending that a bunch of fantasies that were cooked up to excite 12-year-old boys between the two world wars is an infallible guide to the future, the sooner I think we can start looking at the many, many other interesting futures that we can actually have and maybe get to work building one or more of them.
And do you think that there's a civilizational mythological complex out there, maybe in some small group, maybe as a larger group, who knows, that is in an ascending phase, or that maybe has a more adult way to contain the sort of pushback of nature than 12-year-olds reading sci-fi and acting those fantasies?
Well, don't despise the 12-year-olds reading sci-fi. I mean, one of the lessons that our elite classes never learn is that they're not the ones who matter. They're not the ones who dream the dreams that matter. It was because a bunch of sweaty-handed 12-year-olds were reading stories and amazing stories and astounding and things like that we had the space program, and we put boot prints on the moon. It's precise. Right now, there are probably 12-year-olds, and they're probably not in the United States. They could very well be in Mombasa or in Mumbai or in Montevideo, who are busy dreaming some kind of dream that we don't even know about yet. That's what's going to shape the future 100 years from now. So it's really important to remember actual novelty, actually new ideas start on the absolute outer fringes of society, and work their way in from there. So Are there people who are busy dreaming up dreams that will shape our society, that will provide a framework, the framework for the world as the second religiosity begins to break down a couple of centuries from now, and and we're forced to deal with the end game of Western civilization?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Do we have any idea what those are? I certainly don't have a clue. You may know, but there will be such ideas. There's always this sort of burbling subterranean ecosystem of strange ideas, and in every age, some of them rise to the surface and become powerful.
So let me try to connect this with another topic that I personally think it's sort of a natural follow-up.
Mm-hmm.
Um, you wrote a book called Polarity Magic that explores sublimating erotic energies, and it explores
Mm-hmm.
how the different polarities of energies in the body, um,
Mm-hmm.
called erotic, might have a impact on magic. And we've been
Mm-hmm.
discussing 12-year-olds fantasies, and
Mm-hmm.
when you describe a 12-year-old, there's one characteristic: it's prepubescent. It
Mm-hmm.
doesn't meet the real and the sexual and the natural in a way that's um, perhaps adult. I wonder if there's a point about the connection between these two ideas, right? This will to
Oh, very
project
much so.
outwards. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. First of all, in case any of our listeners are hanging their heads now, going, "Oh God, here we go with Harry Potter schlock." No, remember that magic is the art and science of causing change in consciousness in accordance with wills. We are not talking about waving a wand and babbling something in ungrammatical Latin and having the laws of nature, grovel before you. We're talking about ways to transform consciousness. Obviously, sexual energies transform consciousness. Most of us have had that experience rather often. And um, that, the specific system of polarity magic that I wrote about in that book, the one that was largely pioneered by Dion Fortune and the English occultists who worked with her back in the day, worked with taking that energy and sublimating, redirecting it away from the genitalia into other purposes. Now, that's something that takes place a great deal during precisely the sort of late prepubescency. Is that even a word? Late childhood and into the teen years, because our society, like every sane society, does not encourage children when puberty hits them to run out and start having sexual activity. It's a bad idea. Sublimation is useful. And so these 12-year-olds that we were talking about, who are poised on the brink of puberty, who are picking up these exotic copies of pulp science fiction magazines, most of those magazines have scantily clad women on the covers. This is not accidental. It's meant to stir up exactly that creative force. And they all, back in the day, of course, these were in the day when you could not actually publish descriptions of sexual activity, but you could hint very closely. Then, of course, there's the fact that, oddly enough, all these spacecraft, as indeed our rockets do, resemble nothing so much as gigantic metal penises penetrating outer space. Therein are mysteries with which Freud would have a field day. It's no accident that all of this stuff has such a profoundly sexual dimension to it, precisely because it was mostly the reading material of young men or boys on the brink of puberty or in the early stages thereof. And they were sublimating, to some extent, these sexual energies that were surging within them into these dreams and charging and empowering them. I don't happen to know what 12-year-olds are doing that with these days. I'm almost afraid to ask. But yes, there's a direct connection between this, and anytime you take the life force, this surging life force that creates, new human beings, and pour it into something else, whether that be the arts, the sciences, visions of the future, dreams about the past, you name it, that's energy. You're hooking things up to a very, very powerful current, and strange things happen when that's done.
But here's where I think certainly in the 90s and the 2000s, the Japanese were really up to some stuff, because some of the video games that they were making that our generation were playing when we were young fits precisely into that pattern. For example, I can give the Legend of Zelda games, which are still going. But in the 90s, in the 2000s. It's this kind of mythic cycle around going and rescuing the hot young princess from the evil bad guy. There's elemental magic, there's quests that you go on. And I think everybody who plays those games were touched by them. Fucking
Mhm.
forward 25 years later or 20 years later, I had a bit of a fucking balls hitting the wall moment. I just happened to type Zelda into a gematria calculator and I got 9-3. And I went, oh,
Rescue the princess shall be the whole of the law. Gotcha. That's great.
yeah. Also up there with the word Lemurian, which brings us back to Nick Land as well. This whole 9-3 card. But anyway, we can go there in a second. First, let's stay with anime and Japanese video games and pop culture, because that's what I think a lot of the young teenagers are into. It's this
Mm-hmm.
Japanese and now Korean influence that again has this kind of mythic, kind of prepubescent vibe, but then also sexy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's precisely the same kind of vibe that you see on the old pulp magazine covers from a century ago. It's got a sexual dimension, but it is weirdly prepubescent in its sexuality, poised on the brink of polymorphous perversity. It's weird stuff. But yeah, okay. Now all of this is a foreign country to me. I mean, I have never played a video game. I know that makes me utterly outcast from modern culture, but there it is. I have read some manga,
You know what's
but
in,
I'm sorry.
but you know what's interesting? While you may have not, might never have played a video game such as, Pokemon, which is a game where you have to go out and pick and capture a lot of pocket monsters. You've certainly
Mm-hmm.
heard of grimoires and lists
Oh
of,
yeah.
of of demons, and I don't think that
Oh
there's
yeah.
much
Yeah.
difference.
Okay. Well, the thing, of course, is that generally, I mean, I've seen images of the various pocket monsters, and none of them are anything like as ugly as demons are supposed to be, based on the early modern illustrations thereof. So it's as you'd expect the Japanese culture with its tendency toward cute. But yeah, there's definitely a picking up of a lot of old imagery. I understand that there's both a lot of material from Japanese um, folk esotericism, a lot of material from Shinto, a lot of material from Japanese folklore, but also a lot of borrowings from Western magic and folklore and so on. So you have this fascinating sort of cultural stew out of which manga and anime creators are taking these big scoops for their own use. To what extent is this building the sort of foundation for further involvement in magic or a remythologization of the world? That's a really good question, and I suspect we will see the answer in the years immediately ahead.
Well, certainly one thing that does stand out is that this type of media is very popular in the tech crowd.
Mm-hmm. It intrigues me that the tech bros and the tech crowd generally should be so open to fantasy.
Hmm.
I mean, to the extent that the ones who are really into old-fashioned nuts and bolts science fiction are almost a subclass, as far as I can tell. But yeah, they seem to be so open to the fantastic, the mythological, the archetypal, the magical. Maybe it's the return of the repressed, since given what they deal with on a day-to-day basis. But it's intriguing.
What is there in Shinto? I don't really know anything about Shinto, but I'm fascinated by that. What you said, this kind of mix of
Mm-hmm.
Western folk culture. I mean, even those Zelda games that I mentioned does seem to have this mix of Shinto with an almost Lord of the Ringsy style
Oh
European
yeah.
medieval dream.
Oh yeah. Well, okay. Shinto is the traditional polytheist faith in Japan. It was there before the Buddhists got there, and it's a classic polytheism. There are I think supposed to be 8 million gods in Shinto kami, ranging from very very powerful kami such as Amaterasu no Omi kami, the sun goddess, all the way down to some very very minor kami. Thus, it's very much like say Greek or Roman or Celtic religion back in the day. Um, it is like the old polytheism. It's not primarily focused on moral preaching. It's more focused on establishing harmonious relationships between the human and the unhuman worlds. like most of these old traditions, like all of the old traditions I've ever heard of, it includes a vast number of other spirits. It's a very crowded universe. And many of them are very colorful. Many of the yokai, the Japanese monsters, are really quite amazing critters. And but yeah, I mean, I am not sure why of all things. I mean, I would have in all the hurly-burly of introducing Asian religions to the Western world, and we've seen a huge amount of that, especially in the United States, of course. There hasn't been much presence of much of inroads made by Shinto here, and that surprises me. Maybe that's going to be one of the, one of the major events of the next few decades. But it is, if you're familiar with any of the old polytheisms, you'll recognize a lot of things in Shinto. And if you're familiar with old world folklore, where there are all kinds of elves and spirits and goblins and this kind of the other, there again, Japanese folklore parallels that very closely.
Yeah, it's I'm just wondering now. That's maybe it was the fact that the video games started coming from there. It's like the West was
Mm-hmm.
churning out crappy Hollywood movies, and the Japanese went, "There's an approach here,"
Yeah.
and they jumped onto it.
And I think almost they got sucked into the market because, because the stuff coming out of Hollywood has just been regrettable.
Mhm. Yeah, it does certainly seem like it's one of those cases of this larger exercise that I like to do, and that maybe we could move into a little bit, which is the exercise of trying to spot some instances of inadvertent or accidental occultism or magic or esotericism in everyday culture. So the fact that people, explicitly or probably most of the time implicitly and by accident, just end up repeating these occult archetypes. So I want to ask you, do you have sort of on the top of your mind a example that you feel is super explicit and obvious of, maybe it's in politics or entertainment or technology culture? I know we've spoken about the King in Orange, where an example where you see, something truly magical happening, or something truly displaying the fingerprint of the esoteric happening.
Well, I think really right now we do have to cycle back to Donald Trump. I argued in my book, The King in Orange, that what's happened here is that he has become a kind of vessel for the archetype, the Native American archetype of the changer. A lot of the native peoples of this continent have the belief that the world was once very different, and then a being called various names. But he's the changer. He's the one who makes things change, and he goes through the world and changes things, and then he finishes his destiny, and it's changed, and then the people come, and then things are the way they are now. It's a very, very common pattern in Native American tradition. And so one of the things that's distinctive in the versions of the story that I know is that when he changes, whatever he changes stays the way he leaves it. And anyone who kind of cooperates with him is fine. But if you don't cooperate with the changer, you stop changing. He changes you, and then you're stuck there. The classic example is, I'm thinking Tukwal, who is the moon, the changer in some of the Puget Sound legends. He's going up the river, and he's meeting all these people who think they're going to stop him. And so here's this guy with a couple of like sharp branches that he has, and he's planning on poking the changer with him and killing him. And so the changer sticks these branches onto the guy's head and says, "From now on, your name is Deer. When the people come, they're going to hunt you for your meat." And he's been that ever since. Look at what's been happening to Donald Trump's opponents. They're going through the same motions over and over and over again. He's putting a protest sign in their hand and a pussy hat on their head and saying, "Okay, from now on, your name is Protester. When the people come, they'll meme you for the lulz." And nothing changes for them ever again. They're still, doing exactly the same thing. So I see this as a very archetypal pattern. I mean, I don't think Donald Trump has the least idea that he's become a vehicle for an archetype. I don't think he's conscious of it at all. But we don't have to be conscious of our archetypes. I don't think the protesters, in fact, I know from having tried to have conversations with some of them, they have no clue that they're just stuck in the endless loop, repeating a failed pattern, and they'll keep doing it until they die.
It's interesting, Mike.
So we have that.
Go on, John.
We have that as one really good example of a sort of archetypal pattern at work, which has seized people and won't let them go. That's one of the things that what's Jung's phrase? The German verb is ergriffen, to be seized, to be grabbed, and the state of Ergriffenheit. If I'm probably mangling the pronunciation. Jung notes that this is one of the real indications that something archetypal is going on. If something grabs someone and doesn't let them go, you know the archetypes are in motion, and that's that usually leads to destruction, because the only archetype that is balanced is the archetype of the self, and that's an archetype of free consciousness. If you're grabbed by any of the others, it's going to drag you off balance to your destruction. And as we see that echoed in Greek mythology a lot, where somebody will be doing something the gods don't want, and the gods will go, okay, you are going to do this thing until it kills you. And they do.
That's so fascinating. While we were discussing this, I ChatGPT the term Gelassenheit, and I remember listening to Sloterdijk talk about it recently. And Sloterdijk said, Meister Eckhart says that Gelassenheit is all about this emptying of the ego or of the self, so that God may fill the soul. And I sense from what you're saying, effectively, is that if you do not empty yourself consciously, the changer will
empty you and then put into you what he wants, which may not be something you want.
Exactly.
Yeah. You can accept that the world is changing and move with it, or you can try to stand against it and be broken, as the Taoists always used to say. You don't. It's the basic logic of Tai Chi as a combat art. Somebody throws a punch at you, you don't block the punch. You just get out of its way and let them go into empty space.
So it seems then that we're circling around this theme of Donald Trump acting out the archetype of the changer, of the one who's tilling the soil of the earth and changing it for whatever comes next. Is there, is that the chief spiritual principle acting out in the world today, or do we see other things emerging? I'm thinking about AI specifically, and is there a connection there? Is there any other spiritual principle you see moving about?
Well, I am, of course, since I live in the United States and I'm strongly influenced by what's going on here, I see the changer is a North American archetype. It's not something that is shaping, I think, the rest of the world so much, except to the extent that America still has a lot of cultural energy, a lot of cultural domination, and so people are being sucked along its path. What we're seeing in the Middle East, by contrast, is yet another instantiation of the old archetype. You mentioned earlier, when you mentioned earlier that things were getting biblical there. Well, there's no better place for things to get biblical than the place where the Bible was written. It's the classic working out of the usual biblical and generally Middle Eastern, desert, Abrahamic, scripturally based religion idea of apocalypse, of the Armageddon, the war between good and evil. Of course, every time that happens, both sides think that they're good and the other guy's evil. And so we have the Israelis convinced that they're in the right, and the Iranians convinced that they're in the right, flinging bombs and rockets at each other, and that will continue. I mean, eventually, I'm sure they will patch things up, but it's the Middle East is not a good place for peace. I don't think it ever has been. Go ahead.
So you mentioned place, right? And we spoke about these archetypes. Do you think these archetypes belong to a place or to a people's?
Oh, one of the great blind spots of our Western way of thinking is a blindness to the spiritual power of place. there are a lot of things in American culture these days that have nothing to do with the mostly European ancestry of the people who currently inhabit North America, and I include, Hispanic as well as Anglo populations there. They seem far more attuned to what was going on there during the heyday of the Native American cultures. So, in fact, the Native American philosopher Lemuria Jr. made, in his book God is Red, made a very strong case for the idea that place as such has spiritual energy, has spiritual possibilities and preferences and strange attractors. And so whoever moves to a given area will gradually morph, be drawn into these older patterns. This is the reason why European Christianity, for example, has so little in common with Middle Eastern Christianity. It's the reason why, if you go to Indonesia, for example, which is, I think, the world's largest Muslim country, the Islam there is kind of a Far Eastern Islam. It's a very different kind of thing. And the same seems to be pretty much true of everywhere. So I think really whoever inhabits the Middle East is going to end up caught up in the same sort of holy war spirit that's been going on there for the last 5,000 years, where the god of our city our city state commands us to go forth and vanquish the god of the neighboring city state. When whether we're talking about armies armed with bronze spears or armies armed with nuclear warheads, it's the same spirit.
Is there something that the Western mind, I think we touched on that, tends to underestimate? Because certainly in our philosophies and our philosophies, our sciences, we don't think about that relationship between space and mind very.
Mhm.
Maybe that's something
Mhm.
that's a blind spot of the Faustian worldview.
Very much so. Very much so. The Faustian worldview has hardwired into it this craving for infinite linear expansion.
Mm.
This idea that, first of all, if you have some truth, it isn't just your truth, it has to be everyone's truth. Look at the way that people behave with diets. If somebody in the Western world becomes convinced that X diet is good for them, by God, they have to ram it down everyone else's throats. Everyone must be convinced this is the one true diet, blah, blah, blah. That's the Faustian spirit. In the same way, we've been fixated since Viking times with the annihilation of space, the idea that we can travel infinitely far as fast as possible. Elon Musk is kind of the extreme example of that. He would fly to the Andromeda galaxy if he thought he could, just to prove that he could. This is not an obsession that you see in any other culture, really. And so it blinds spirituality. Even here in the United States, the United States is not a single country. It's a single political unit. But I've lived in a number of different regions at this point, and they're very, very different. New England, where I live now, is for all practical purposes a different country. It's just that it happens to be under the same political leadership these days. And so this entire sense of place, this sense of rootedness in realities that are spiritual ultimately in nature, is something that we will have to learn probably over as the Faustian world disintegrates.
At the very, very high level of avant-garde architecture, we happen to know one of the architects behind Zaha Hadid Architects, and they're going much towards this the philosophy they call tectonism. So building buildings inspired by the deep movements of geological plates, which
Mm-hmm.
I find really fascinating. And similarly in music, there's ambient music going on now that's basically
Mm-hmm.
ditched time signatures altogether. It's much more these
Mm-hmm.
landscapes that sound more like clouds moving. And I see
Mm-hmm.
in that a new naturalism, like a technologically
Mm-hmm.
enhanced
Mm-hmm.
naturalism. And I wonder if there's something going on there that this Faustian spirit that is trying to kind of one way for everything, as you said,
Mm-hmm.
happens as much in it does in how we measure rhythm as how we measure space, is being blown
Oh
up
yeah.
by this new. I'm just tectonism is
Hmm.
a nice word for it.
Hmm.
The sort of avant-garde of art and design is going towards.
Hmm. I certainly hope so, because one size fits all is generally a very poor strategy. The international style in architecture, for example, which tried to produced uniform ugliness across 6 continents. Um, it produced buildings that never really fit in anywhere. And I would love to see more architecture that draws from the spirit of the place, that pays attention. I mean, it's great that it's paying attention to tectonic plates. I would like to see an architecture that pays more attention to the shape of trees and hills,
Hmm.
that pays attention to the different shapes of clouds. One of the real revelations that I had when I started moving from place to place is that the sky does not look the same in different parts of the world. And so very much, getting into the an architecture that is part of the countryside, part of the land, part of the cityscape, because cities are also ecosystems. Um, and the fact that it's emerging now is, I think, both a good sign and an inevitable sign, because the Faustian, I mean, some civilizations manage to hang on for the long term. Egypt and China are great examples. Egypt lasted until the Muslim conquest. Um, China lasted until 1949, and thousands of years of duration. Faustian civilization can't do that because it doesn't have any sense of keeping things stable. It hates stability. It hates limitation. It hates all the things that enable you to have duration. And so I expect Faustian civilization to crash and burn in very short order. And in the centuries immediately ahead, to just collapse in on itself. So if people are already starting to look at other alternatives and saying, okay, well, why don't we just give up this notion of infinite extension in space and start paying attention to where we are? Um, like what was the album by Firesign Theater back in the days? How can you be two places at once when you're not anywhere at all?
So this leads me to kind of a burning question, right? We've been talking about
Mm-hmm.
the existence of this topological character, this genius loci of the material world,
Mm-hmm.
and depending on where you are, there's a certain spirituality to it. In the U.S., there's this deeper, more ancient, more native tradition. You mentioned that the
Mm-hmm.
Middle East has that character, but what about when I think of topology, I immediately go like my mind went to the traditional Christian anatomy of the spheres, of the planetary spheres, at the
Mm-hmm.
top of which is God, and then there's this sort of
Mm-hmm.
hypostasis of His grace falling down, or even the Kabbalistic one where things
Mm-hmm.
come down
Mm-hmm.
from the spheres, and it makes me think about the relationship between space and time, right? The traditionalists like Guénon say that
Mm-hmm.
if you go out of space time, then that's the eternal, and I wonder what you make of all of this, because we've been talking about space. Then what happens in the spheres? Do the
Okay.
spheres change depending on
This
where you
this
look at them from?
concept. Go ahead. I'm sorry. You were saying.
No, you go ahead.
Okay. This concept of nested spheres, in its mature, developed form, I see it as the supreme cosmological creation of what Spengler referred to as Magian civilization, the civilization of the Near East. And that was something. There was a very strong Magian pseudomorphosis over Western society during the Middle Ages, into the Renaissance, to the early part of the early modern world. And so you have this, it's not accidental that Magian society was the society that most perfected the dome as an architectural form. This is the physical image of that sphere. It is an image of a world enclosed, an image of a world where you have the divine sort of wrapping around this little bubble of manifest existence, and so on. It's not accidental that the traditionalists are into that, but because the traditionalists are really the last defenders of the Magian pseudomorphosis. That's why it's not accidental that Guénon ended up going to Egypt and becoming a Muslim, because that's kind of the natural endpoint of that whole energy, an attempt to maintain that Magian vision in the face of the reign of quantity, which is Faustian, which is fundamentally Faustian in nature. In fact, all of the various trends and so on that Guénon was exploring in his book, The Reign of Quantity, are all part of that sort of Faustian spatial quantitative expansion vision. Here we get complex because what's going on here in the United States is the emergence will eventually lead to the emergence of a different modality, which cannot be described in terms of these nested spheres, or in terms of Faustian infinite expansion, or in any of these other things. It is a different vision, is a more textured one, a more complex one. Simultaneously, of course, if various teachings and traditions are correct, we have what's going on in Russia, where yet another high culture is kind of trembling on the verge of being born, and it will also have its own radically different vision, which may take over some aspects of the Faustian or the Magian. We'll see, but it will have its own vision of the world. I think it's essential here to keep Spengler's understanding in mind, and realize that there is no one truth about the universe, that every society every great culture creates its own fundamental vision of the cosmos and works through all the possibilities of that. I suppose from a spiritual standpoint, you could say that that's part of the process by which human beings, by which humanity is exploring all the different ways it's possible for us to be human. So there's a Faustian way, and we're kind of running out of ground on that one. There's the Magian way, which settled into kind of a rut a while ago, but it's a very, very creative rut in its own way. We have some of these new patterns come into being. We know of older ones, the Apollonian, the Egyptian, and so on. But one of the reasons, just to bring in a kind of a side issue, one of the reasons that I recently wrote a new book on the Kabbalah, one that's based on the teachings I received from my teacher, John Gilbert, is precisely that the very Magian version of that way of looking at the world, this whole vision of the spheres of the universe as created by this descending current from God and so on. That works to those who can see the world that way, but that's increasingly not a natural way for people to see the world in some parts of it, such as here in the United States.
How do people see it in the United States?
Yeah, we're still groping toward a vision, but the metaphor that I like to use is one that comes from the northwestern part of the United States. It's a word in the Chinook jargon, which was a trade language created by Native Americans out of half a dozen Native American languages, plus chunks of Indian or of English and French, and I don't think anyone knows what all else. But in Chinookwawa, to use its own name for itself, the term is Tamanawas. A Tamanawas is the individual's guardian spirit. You probably read about vision quests. That's kind of one expression of that. But basically, the idea is that the idea within the principle of Tamanawas is there is no one spiritual force that everybody should relate to, that everybody orients toward a personal inner source of guidance, which opens out into the spiritual realm, that everyone has a relationship with such a guardian spirit, which is also one's luck and one's destiny. And so and a good example of this was a Native American dance I was privileged to witness once north of Everett, Washington, on the shores of Puget Sound. I ended up, this thing, long, complex story. We don't have to go there. But it was, in effect, a longhouse, modern construction methods, but it was like one of the old longhouses, and they had basically a big plank down the middle of it on trestles, and there's a long line of people with beaters beating the most fantastically complex pattern of rhythms. I don't think any two people were beating exactly the same, but it all turned into this very rich, textured, rhythmic pattern, and people would start getting up and dancing, and each was dancing the dance of their own Tamanawas, their own guardian spirit. And no two of them were dancing in the same steps. No two of them were making the same motions. And yet somehow it worked out into a harmony. That is, I think, where the North American egregore, where the North American land spirit is pulling us toward a point, a way of organizing that's literally incomprehensible from either a Magian or a Faustian viewpoint. There is no one central example around which everyone's focused, the way that in the Muslim world everyone's supposed to sort of take Muhammad as their example, the way in the Christian world, the imitatio Christi, the imitation of Christ, everyone takes Jesus as their example. There is no one example. But there also isn't one rule for everyone, one true diet, one true religion, one true what have you. The Faustian spirit of imposing these abstract patterns on everyone. It's a matter of organization through the interactions, the free interactions of individuals. And it's not something we can do yet. It's not something we will be able to do yet for some centuries. We have a long ways to go before we can actually bring that to being. But you can see the stirrings of it in some very odd ways in our culture.
You know what it reminds me of, which is interesting, is that actually I just mentioned a second ago, the Zaha Hadid architects firm, Patrick Schumacher, who's the guy, he's one of her disciples. The way he writes about the design theory is a shift from extensive complexity to intensive complexity.
Nice.
Long words, and he uses, and you'll like this, the exact metaphor he uses is opposed to garbage spill urbanism, where everybody's just trying to do something brand new that stands out and you end up with a total mess. It should look much more like the natural landscape, where actually there's a relatively small number of morphologies, trees and rivers and hills and stones, but infinite complexity within those morphologies. And
that works very well as a description. I'm going to be looking this up.
The other interesting thing, right, is that Zaha, she was a woman in the field of architecture, and she's Iraqi. And there's clearly an influence of Islamic architecture, but then she bends and distorts it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's like Muhammad finally took psychedelics.
Funny. Yeah. Well, it sounds very interesting. I'll reserve judgment until I have a chance to actually get into it and do some reading and look at some of the products of the movement, but it certainly sounds promising.
What are you thinking, Daniel? You look deep in thought. And you're muted as well.
Okay. Yeah, I was trying to formulate this. Here's an attempt. So one is usually bound by the technological possibilities of the present moment, right? You can only dance to rhythmic patterns so long as there are drums and a community and maybe a roof over your heads. So there's a way in which the material kind of determines what gets to be done. So in the last 200 years, the Faustian spirit sort of lent the world vastly new possibilities to communicate, to exchange information across the world, the internet notably, and this is pretty much the culmination of a technological arms race between those who could and those who couldn't, and then had to pick up. And now it's kind of leading to obviously the age of AI, where the disembodied voice is just out there. And I wonder, and you can talk to it, and it's the new way to interact with technology. And I wonder, do these affordances, right? Do they have a say on the new dances that the new forms of expression will have to do in the future, to in the same way that the drums were the context setter of the previous manifestation of our inner spirits, if that makes sense?
It does. The first thing that I will have to mention, though, is that AI is only possible given fantastic expenditures of energy and resources. It's incredibly energy and resource intensive, and that's its main constraint right now. It's fascinating me that so few people have noticed, for example, that just to power the AI projects currently on the board here in the United States, the U.S. will have to increase its production of electricity by a factor of 3. We're going to have to triple our electricity production just to run these AI projects. Is that going to happen? No, it's not. The resources aren't there. This is why we have yet another attempt to rush into the vast white elephant of nuclear power. We've got to. That's another of those Faustian dreams, another of those 1920s sweaty palmed 12-year-old dreams. Limitless power from the atom. It doesn't work that way. Nuclear power never pays for itself, and we're going to find that out the hard way in a few years again. But the problem that you see, what we have here, as with so much of the Faustian system, we have the building up of enormous but temporary capacities. And so I expect to see the AI thing start tripping over its own feet in fairly short order as limitations in energy and resources start cutting in, and access becomes a little more difficult, and problems increase. It's a complex field. How long the internet will last is a really interesting question, because it's not as though the Earth is churning out endless quantities of fossil fuels or endless quantities of rare earth metals just so we can keep on using them at an ever accelerating rate. So we live in a very fascinating window of time in which it's actually possible to get access to this fantastic amount of information, comparable but on a far more extreme level than the days when you could go to the Library of Alexandria and read. There were more scrolls there than anybody could actually read, which is unthinkable in terms of earlier times. We're in that case doubled, tripled in spades. And so at the moment, we can gather all these different things. How long will that last? How long will that remain? My guess is that the Tomanos culture of the American future will emerge long after all of that is a matter of distant memory. Because I honestly don't expect AI to outlast this century, simply because of the incredibly huge resource demands. And I'd be surprised if the internet makes it to the end of the century. We'll see. And generally, we have all of these issues of catabolic collapse increasingly building, and that's the flip side. So it will be one thing when people are telling stories about back in the day when you just could take this box and ask it questions. It will tell you the answer to anything. But such stories have been written in the past, and as long as they're just stories, their impact on what people can actually do is somewhat limited.
There's a case to be made that they'll start rolling in the internet and the AIs long before they run out of energy, just to fucking stop people going mental.
Well, there's that also. Yeah, what I expect to happen is primarily rationing by price.
Yeah.
We're already getting to the point that the internet is becoming increasingly difficult to use. Search engines are a complete waste of time these days, because they have to focus on monetizing everything to try to make make a profit. That's going to become more and more the case, and increasingly access fees are going to start coming into place. I expect to see email stop being free. I expect to see just the costs will increase and increase and increase until more and more people are simply cut out. And then you'll start seeing the emergence of sort of, on the one hand, a kind of peripheral ways of exploiting the internet without having direct access to it. On the other hand, you'll see the emergence of alternative patterns, hopefully borrowed from the recent past, ways of getting information in circulation and so on. But there will be that division until eventually the number of people who have access to the internet, to the AI, things like that, is so small that simply erased the next time we have an elite replacement cycle, and a certain class is overthrown.
Yeah, there's already people talking about what they're calling the post-web, which is this idea that the internet is just not fucking nice to be surfing yourself. So you'll just have an AI that you tell to do, and the AI will interface with the internet for you. So then it only takes some clever entrepreneur to go, all right, well, it's pay to use though. So you pay 99 cents and then you get your AI to use the internet for how you want. You go, okay, great.
Exactly. But then you're completely dependent on what the AI decides to tell you, and since the AI is owned by someone else, it becomes a means of information control.
Yeah, it's like the Netflix of AI.
Exactly. Well, but increasingly like the big brother of AI.
Yes.
And somebody was talking the other day about something they've seen on the media, this claim that some inventor or others trying to come up with this wearable AI thing which will be constantly talking to you. And there we have, on the one hand, the complete mental breakdown. On the other hand, we have complete control by the corporate system. We might, I would suggest as a brand name for them, Mephistopheles. You have your very own corporate tempter perched on your shoulder, telling you what to think. And it amazes me that people are responding to this in any way other than, oh my God, no.
I guess that's perhaps an interesting thing to notice about the current sort of technological Faustian moment we are going through. It's that it's not just about the technology, but what it has done to us. It has put us in a position where the appetite for such a thing is high. And of course, many comparisons have been made between the current moment and late Rome and all those religious replacements that were taking place. And all of a sudden you have Christianity taking over. A new man, a new human, a human that's perhaps okay with having a different structure of his own being. Maybe it's okay to have a tech talking to you, or in the same way.
But notice that the reason Christianity took over is that it appealed to the poor, to women, to slaves. All of the religions that appealed to the privileged, they died.
And do you think?
I expect that's normal. The same thing typically happens. People are going to be putting on these little AI things and being told what they're told to tell. Again, keep in mind, all of these things are someone else's property. All of these things do what they're told by someone else. If anything, I could see a sort of a Butlerian jihad, to borrow a term from Dune. Quote, once men turned their thinking over to machines, thinking that they would liberate them, that this would liberate them, but it only allowed other people who controlled the machines to enslave them. That's the Reverend Mother, Gaius Helen Mohiam, explaining to Paul exactly why nobody uses computers anymore in the Dune future. As usual, Herbert was very well ahead of his time. And, sure, there will be many people who will accept that slavery for now, while it can be afforded, until the downsides become too obvious.
It's fascinating you bring that in. I've just been reading Dune the last couple of days and just reading it's going. And I've never read the book before, and I've seen the
Good
films
heavens.
recently, but I'm going, Jesus Christ, like he fucking saw what was coming.
And this is one of the reasons that I tend to avoid movies a lot, because so often the books have so much more meat to them, and that's especially the case with Dune. I did see the old David Lynch movie. I happened to be given some free tickets to the premiere, and have regretted it ever since. But I haven't seen the more recent ones. I don't know if they did anything better. But one of the things about fiction is that it can actually put you inside the headspace of the people who are doing things. It can build narrative in a way that's not just external. And movies can't really do that. And so the whole realm of ideas that shapes Dune, or for that matter, The Lord of the Rings, or really any one of the major literary works of our age, especially those in science fiction and fantasy, that whole world is impossible to communicate. It's the reason why H.P. Lovecraft movies all suck. Because you can't, cinematic methods will not put you inside his brilliantly deranged worldview. You can't get that sense of, hold it, here's this world I think I live in, and where is that tentacle coming from? That pervades his fiction, the sense of inhumanism, of the recognition of the sheer fragility of human existence, and the extent to which our existence is an illusion constructed by our ignorance. You can't even begin to get that using any imagistic mean. Fiction can do it easily. So, yeah.
It's true.
Read the book.
No, it's
Read
it's
the book.
it's a real pleasure going to the book actually. But I do think it's interesting that a story like Dune has suddenly picked up big budget, even if it's not giving you the inner world. The fact that Hollywood is doing Dune, which by all means is it's not celebrating the achievements of modern civilization by any means. The fact that
No,
that
that's
movie
true.
is becoming current now, and I noticed Netflix did a production of Mr. Giovanni Lampedusa's The Leopard. Are you familiar with that work?
No, I'm not.
It's so here's the funny thing is that I was talking to my Neapolitan friend a few months ago, and he said, "Oh, you've got to
Hmm.
read this book. It's perfect for thinking about what's happening in the world right now." Basically, it's a story about Italian unification told from the
Hmm.
perspective of the Sicilian aristocrats who
Interesting.
are wrapped up in it, but basically the way the new capitalists and the new Italian nationalists come off is not very well at all. The Sicilians are presented as kind of sleepy and kind of done for, but it's ultimately a story that's sympathetic to the aristocracy rather than the moderns.
Hmm.
That also just
Interesting.
had a big budget Netflix production behind it. So there's
Fascinating.
something
I
interesting going
I
on
will
in
go.
culture.
That sounds like a book. That sounds like a book I will want to read.
It's a fantastic book. It's a short little book as well. It's only a couple of pages, a couple of hundred pages.
Just a couple of hundred.
No.
These days, that's a short little book. Yeah, yeah. Okay, okay. Thank you. I will. That interests me. But yeah, um, the thing is, I think the the one of the things that's cracking apart as the Faustian dream breaks down is precisely this sense of unanimity, this sense that yes, we are in fact charging, marching boldly onward to conquer the universe beneath the banner of logic and reason. That whole thing is going away now, and I'm not at least surprised that people are starting to sense that on one level or another. I mean, I owe the fact that I have a career as a fiction writer to the fact that people are potentially open to that, because all of my novels tend to approach the world from that, from a one of several viewpoints that are not exactly sympathetic to the Faustian worldview.
One thing that I usually struggle with reading is how many of the big actors in the world are genuine Faustians, and how many of them, in our era, and how many are cynical ones that
Mm-hmm.
are playing a sort of an ulterior game. How do you read it?
Mm-hmm. These days there aren't many genuine Faustians left. And of course, there's also the awkward little point that those are not two mutually exclusive categories. They're kind of two ends of a spectrum. There are people who are, who have some kind of genuine Faustian beliefs, but they're well aware of the personal advantages that will accrue to them from pushing those. And there are people who are, generally just in it for for what they can get out of it. But there's this kind of little, uneasy sense that, well, yes, but the Faustian thing is the way the future is going. So you have a lot of mixed motives. You have a lot of you have a lot of people who are just in between. I don't know that it's possible to tell who's on which side at this point. The spin doctoring is so profound, and it's not as though we have direct access to any of these people. So, so it's anyone's guess in any given position. But certainly, it is always worth considering the possibility that they're just faking it for their own personal advantage. But it's also always worth considering the possibility that maybe they really do believe in this. That when Donald Trump is going on "Make America Great Again," it's not just that he thinks he's got a slogan that will make people follow him. He genuinely, at some level, thinks that he can make America great again, and that's what sort of fires, or part of what fires him up.
Yeah, the edifice, the mental edifice of modernity, and the fact that there's so many different motivations
Mm-hmm.
is mental. That's why one of the most interesting things or movements or genres of tech that I see happening today, creatively speaking, tends to be what a company that maybe, they do defense and they do supply chain, called Palantir. But what
Mm-hmm.
they do as a sort of at a general level and is very interesting in that they attempt to put sense and readability into an otherwise complete mess of motives and data points. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes that has a role in the supply chain of importing bananas from Peru or manufacturing
Mm-hmm.
phone. But
Mm-hmm.
on the other hand, I'm usually fascinated. Could we use Palantir to discover or to read or to understand or to navigate a little bit better these jumbled incentives and motives of people, in the mental plane and in the spiritual plane
Good
as well?
question. Good question. It's since I don't have the technical wherewithal to judge how accurate, I tend to avoid such things. But there are those who are into tech, and I say, do what keepeth us from wilting shall be the loophole in the law. Really, I think one of the things that's going on now is precisely a sorting out of people into different tech categories. We have increasingly retro tech becoming a big deal. I glance right now to one side and I see a very nice stereo system, circa 1990, sitting on top of my shelves. I have plenty of vinyl records, and that's a tech that I'm comfortable with. It's a tech that I get good results from, and there's a whole subculture of people who will not use the online digital media for their music. They want their own records. They want their own libraries of music. That has certain disadvantages, but it does mean that if anything happens to the internet, there's a lot of music still available as long as there's electricity. And so I see that more generally, we have people who are starting to sort themselves out into different classes of technology, different levels. There are people for whom music is something you play on wooden instruments. That's a significant scene these days, and they don't do electronic things. Many of them don't. The ones that I know, they don't have stereos. No, music, you play music or you sing music, and it goes from there all the way up to the people who are who will probably in a few years have AI curated music playing 24/7 in their homes. And that division, that sorting out process, because it's into many different levels of engagement with technology, strikes me as very sensible. Because if one or another mode turns out to be fatally dysfunctional, if, for example, AI turns out, people who get deep into AI turn out to wig out mentally consistently, they get this feedback loop of stuff going into them, and they just go catatonic or something, then that doesn't mean we're all on our way back to the caves. It means we fall back to the next cohort of people who are using a simpler technology. And so this is something I talked about many years ago in my first blog, about how we need, if you're climbing a ladder, you don't want to kick out every rung after you climb past it. So if you have a technological ladder of many rungs, and there are people who are comfortable on each rung, you have a lot more resilience than if you don't.
The parallel that comes to mind is how when maybe a person during a psychedelic experience, or based on what I've heard, people who are undergoing sort of magical experiences and exercises, how there's a moment where there's a certain risk of psychosis. There's a certain risk of there's no sense anymore because of the flood.
Yes.
And the ability to make sense and pattern match within the flood, being regained after that crossing of the valley is rather interesting, and it feels almost like that's what's happening now at a collective scale. The globe.
That makes a great deal of sense. Go on.
Yeah, it feels like the global the noosphere in the globe is becoming so complex and jumbled, and it's so hard to make any coherent sense about like what's happening, right? There's so many people trying to segment and understand and target and micro target, and AI is churning out so much content that it's going to contribute to sort of this almost psychotic state of nothing making sense, and at the global scale, the global mind, with geopolitical consequences, of course.
That's a very good point. Yeah, no, I think you're right there, because we're dealing with a point of information overload where and also the manufacture of plausible false information overload, shall we say, especially in the age of AI. It is impossible for anybody at this point to be sure of anything they don't see with their own eyes. If it's on a screen, it can be faked. If it's if it's in a form of a printed picture, it can be faked. You could be watching something that looks like newsreel footage. It can be faked. At this point, and very often is these days, there's enormous pressures behind enormous desires. How many people in the world actually know, for example, what is actually happening between Israel and Iran right now? I don't claim to. I pick up, what various news stories are saying, and they're all, I go to news media from different countries, so they all contradict each other. What exactly is going on? I have no idea. And so we've definitely moved into this state where, first of all, there's too much information to process. Second of all, too much of the information is dubious to be sure about much of anything. And so, yeah, that sort of state of collapse where nothing can be guaranteed to make sense anymore. The sort of Lovecraftian state that he talks about in the opening paragraph of the Call of Cthulhu, where where the only thing that shields us from the terror of the cosmos is how little we know. And if we actually put together the implications of all the sciences, we actually wove together all of the information coming into us, we would either go mad or flee, as Lovecraft calmly says, into the safety and security of a new dark age.
That's precisely like a spiritual trial. That's
exactly
like a spiritual trial.
It's passing through the abyss in Kabbalistic language, and it's something that I think you're right in a certain sense, or in a certain reflected sense, that's going on in terms of our information access in the world. And one of the reasons that it's become impossible for people of different political opinions these days very often to have conversations is they're literally living in different worlds. The information they reach has been curated one way or the other to support mutually incomprehensible worldviews.
And it's so interesting that that's pretty much the polar opposite of the previous Enlightenment rational Faustian way of seeing the world. Wanted to impose the universalism on everyone. This is the truth, the monoculture, and now the polar opposite is taking place, where everyone is their own monoculture.
Well, that's exactly. The thing is, it was inevitable that the Enlightenment vision would turn into its opposite. That kind of enantiodroma is hardwired into it. If you try, once you create the vision of an embrace, you maximize the benefits to those who can claim that their opinion is that truth, and away we go into the age of ideologies, and beyond it into the current age where ideologies are breaking up into wholly individual patterns that where no two people see the world alike.
So let's go and bring in our friends the Lemurians here. What is going on with them? Because, right, Blavatsky was talking about Lemuria in the late 19th century. William S. Burroughs picks it up in the late 20th century. Then Nick Land and his crew pick them up and do most of their major work in the 90s, working on auspices, you could say, of the Lemurians. And even today, if you look at his Twitter feed, he uses phrases like rational brain says this, lemur brain says this. If you take him at his word, there's an element of Nick Land being possessed by some kind of lemur archetype. And if you look at their work on Burroughs and what Burroughs was doing on his Ghost Lemurs of Madagascar and these short stories, it's about the breakdown of linear temporality. That was the method that Burroughs was using to write his text, writing things and then chopping words up and putting them together. That's what he's interested in as a phenomenological category. And I think, to go back to what you guys were saying, something about this information saturation that just annihilates any coherent past or future. History immediately becomes suspect. The entire, you could say, Enlightenment Whig historiography goes out the window immediately. The post-World War II historiography goes out the window immediately. You can now load up ChatGPT and say, write me an alternative history of X, and it will do it. and then tell me how to live my life in this way, bang, it'll do it. What are the Lemurians about?
Okay, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna respond in reverse order because first of all, you didn't need to chat GPT to do that. Are you at all familiar with the amazing phenomenon of the Tartarian Empire?
No.
Yes.
Okay, there is this whole subculture of people who believe that our entire history is fake. That there was this vast global Tartarian empire which created all the really good architecture that's been replaced by the ugly stuff we have now. That put star forts around the world and so on, and that it was annihilated by floods of mud like a century or so ago, I think it was, and that all the history you're taught in the schools has been fake to try to ignore the fact this much better society existed in the past.
Wow.
Look up the Tartarian Empire. It
Looking
is
now.
one of the
Yeah.
weirdest. Yeah, it's one of the weirdest things out there. It's exactly that kind of thing. We've reached a point where history has become. History is always. It's a cliche that history is always written by the winners, but history is always contested. It's always being rewritten in various competing ways, and the problem is that's become so blatant in recent decades that an enormous number of people no longer believe that the history they've been taught is anything but politically motivated garbage. This is what's behind the whole, we never landed on the moon business. It's another way to challenge that claim that we're the masters of creation. And so, and there's more and more of it. But the Tartarian Empire is the most dramatic version that I've seen so far. So you have this widespread recognition that history has become nothing more than stringing together a set of supposed past events to justify the present. Has that always been the case? Yes, Socrates, it has. But now many, many people know it. In the same way, what is the future? Well, it obviously hasn't happened yet. And I think really this is one of the places where all of those endless people droning on about, how 20 years from now we will have fusion power or what have you. All of these bogus futures that we've had, either the Tomorrowland future or the Apocalypse future, that never came to pass, but were promoted by authoritative voices who knew what they were talking about. Trust the science, peasant. They've blown up in their faces. They've literally shot themselves through all four cheeks by pushing these bogus futures over and over again. When there were generations of people who would look and say, "Yeah, I remember when global cooling was the big scare in the late 70s and early 80s." You can get a lot of people to melt down by pointing that out. I have fun with it sometimes, especially since I have some of the books in question. But so you have this tendency to we've had so many manufactured pasts and so many manufactured futures that's caused a collapse in trust, a collapse in the willingness of many people to buy into any agreed upon narrative about the past and the future. Another very important aspect of what we're doing. Lemuria is, in some ways, it's a great example of it because the continent of Lemuria was invented by a biologist to try to explain the distribution of lemurs at a time when continental drift was still considered crackpot pseudoscience. Blavatsky picked it up, moved it a couple of thousand miles due east, and plopped it where there was, in fact, a subcontinent the size of India, which went under the water around 14,000 years ago. I think Sunderland is the approved term for it now. And then it just picked up and became this sort of hovering realm in the collective imagination. There were schools in the United States between the wars and going up until, I think one of them is still open, the Lemurian Fellowship that claimed to pass on these mystic teachings from ancient Lemuria. One of the American Rosicrucian orders was all over the whole Lemuria thing for a while too. And then we have William Burroughs, and then we have Nick Land, and using it in yet another way, and a way that I think is very sensible. Human beings, little canned lecture here, human beings have this, a thin layer of rationality, which we tend to think of as being much more important than it is, over a perfectly ordinary primate nervous system. If you want to call that a lemur nervous system, that's fine. It's there. most of our mental activity, other than just the chatter that goes on the surface, most of our motives, most of our actions, all of our emotions, and all of our instincts are all lemur level stuff. And those actually have a much wider, a much broader impact on our lives and on our activities than most people ever let themselves think. So we've got that lemur level thing there. If you want to play Lemurian games with it and have fun with the word and so on, why not? So the whole Lemurian thing is fascinating and highly amusing as well. But I tend to use baboons myself simply because I talk a lot about politics, and baboons. Congress people believe, politicians behave like baboons. It's just they do. So do most of us. But if you want to use lemurs instead of purple rumped mandrills or what have you, don't let me stop you.
But there's the other side of the lemurs, right? Which is the lemurs is the old Roman pagan spirit that was supposed to be cleansed from the household. So Ovid in his Fasti writes about, he actually gives an instruction for how to cleanse the lemurs on dates, the 9th, the 11th, and the 13th of May. And there's that's what fascinates me, this sort of confluence between everything you've just mentioned and this idea of being haunted by somewhat malevolent spirits that are doing a bad job at cleansing.
Well, the thing is, I see the whole primate thing as a matter of very much a haunting. We pretend, we human beings, especially in the Faustian world, we pretend that we do everything for rational reasons. What we're actually doing most of the time is rationalizing motivations that come from that lemur level of the brain. And so it haunts us, but we try to pretend. We whistle past the graveyard. We insist, no, I'm not acting like a lemur, especially when we're acting like lemurs. But is there a more supernatural aspect there? Is there something spookier going on? Oh, quite possibly.
Yeah, so many threads here. That's it, right? It's an image that's in the mind, and it's clearly very there.
I guess that's probably why there's what I see to be such a big race to control the priors. Like when people don't speak of the Tartarian Empire just for shits and giggles, I guess. I think they also it's almost like a little attempt to see what if we could then fake history and control these priors. There's almost like a Faustian engineering mentality that says, you know what, the lemurs will emerge within these four walls that I will build, which is this concept of history and this concept of society, so as to then produce specific effects in our nervous system that people then reverberate, right? Tell me what history you subscribe to, I'll tell you who you are. And so I wonder if this is the premise of ontological design, right? It's the idea that we just reverberate the context we're in. That the Faustian mechanistic perspective would say, yeah, it's all chemicals in the brain. Whereas maybe another point of view, the Lemurian one, would say, actually, the lemurs also emerge of their own accord in a non-controllable, irrational way. So I wonder, I wonder if this chaos that we live in is self-imposed.
Since so much of this is not being done in a Faustian mode, it's not being done with the illusion of objectivity, which is so central to the Faustian mind. People are simply following the histories or the para-histories, if you want to call it that appeal to them, that motivate them, that give them energy, and that allow them that give them weapons against an increasingly hostile and destructive social environment. And so if you can turn to the black, the black and gold banner of the Tartarian Empire, and you see that as your real history, that transforms who you are in your own perception, and thus transforms who you are in your life and in your actions. So you don't have to sit down and think through it calmly. It's the heart pounds, the eyes go round. You see, oh, that could be the real history, and away we go. That's most of how we, it is that, and that's the lemur. That's the lemur that's speaking. It's not, it's not that thin little layer, the veneer of rationality over the top.
I think that's beautiful.
Well, it is. It's also utterly human. One of the great lies of the Faustian world is the notion that rationality is somehow is is this superpower. It's this. It wipes clean the slate. Here we are. Self-knowing, self-actualizing, blah de blah de blah. Actually, we're just a bunch of lemurs who are making a slightly different variety of hooting noise than the lemurs in the other tree. And it can be a useful kind of hooting noise. Rationality has its advantages. It allows the creation of novels, for example. But there's always that. But most of what's going on is lemur activity, and so people are, even the people who are drawn. We see this the self-immolation of rationalism. Just one of many examples of that I can point to is the so-called skeptic movement that got active in the very late 20th century and is falling apart these days, which was never actually skeptical at all. It had absolute blind faith in any utterance by somebody in a white lab coat. You see this especially in the discussions of pharmaceuticals, for example. If it was approved by a government bureaucracy, no matter how corrupt that bureaucracy was, if it made money for Merck or Pfizer or what have you, then it was real medicine and real science. And if it didn't, by definition, it wasn't. It was just tribal loyalties motivated by money. But that became the focus for all of these fantasies of rational thinking, of pure mind, of logic, of reason, of man the conqueror of nature, etc., and made it painfully clear the whole thing was, again, just the bunch of lemurs in one tree hooting their defiance at a bunch of lemurs in another.
I suspect that this thread and this line of thinking, which is very Lemurian centric, one could call it, is almost like pulling the red thread. And I suspect that it might lead to interesting insights, beautiful insights that perhaps want to emerge or on the way to emerge. When I say beautiful, I don't want to say that they're necessarily safe or
no.
positive.
Beauty is never safe.
Exactly.
Cuteness is safe. Beauty is never safe. No, I think that there are all kinds of directions that we could take that. And in some future conversation with Nick Land, I hope to discuss some of them.
Yes.
Whether or not it happens in Glastonbury.
That's a reminder to everyone listening. If you know Nick Land, if you've got his number,
well, let him know the weird druid guy would love to talk.
I did. I read the other day saying that, but I haven't heard that. Maybe we should call Hermetics, James from Hermetics, because he's had him on.
There you go. But yeah, I mean, I read the CCRI papers and things like that. So I would have to catch up on what he's been doing more recently, but I could do that.
Well, he became
for all I know,
the what's called the Dark Enlightenment, right? He read Curtis and then wrote the Dark Enlightenment essay, and then started the whole neo-reactionary thing, and then got the funniest bit is getting picked up by the guys like Mark Andreessen and the techno-optimists, who then have a muted 12-year-old version of Nick Land in their techno-optimism. It's like they took accelerationism and skipped all of the Ballard and the Burroughs and the Gibson and the horror.
Oh, yes, well, that's one of those things. Speaking of reactions of lemurs.
Yes, one of those things we love you Americans for is that you can just take something so optimistically and run with it.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're about closing up on 2 hours.
It's getting on for that, yeah.
Yeah. So I'm thinking that after such a long conversation, we touched on so many topics. Is there anything, any sort of final message that you want to share? That your lemur is telling you, you know what, this is a good closing message.
No, my inner lemur is hooting. Stay weird. we live in a universe that does not make rational sense. Our philosophers started picking up on the fact quite some time ago that any attempt to map rationality on the universe is simply trying to get the entire cosmos to conform to the evolutionarily generated habits of our own brains, and that's all. And that maybe the Discordians, who worship the goddess of chaos, discord, and confusion, are actually have a more sensible approach all along. But stay weird. The universe is not going to get any less crazy, and there's no reason, if as we gaze up into the, to borrow a Lovecraft image, we're gazing up into the tentacled face of the future. It doesn't make sense. It needn't make sense. Any sense we make is our own choice, and weirdness helps.
It's a message about sovereignty right there.
In a certain sense.
Great stuff. Drop the mic. That's perfect. See you in the pub.